I hate foreigner. I don't like foreigner. Foreigner must go to their country. I am xenophobic. Again, I hate times and times. I don't know how many times. I hate foreigners. I don't have a child because of foreigner. Ramaphosa, take these foreigners to their country right now.
South Africa's anti-immigration protests are not really about immigration. Neither are they about South Africa. They expose one of Africa's biggest development problems. Because we have built a culture that constantly searches for someone else to blame. Today, it is immigrants. Yesterday, it was colonialism. The other day, it was slavery. Tomorrow, it will be someone else. Until that mindset changes, Africa's problems will simply change faces rather than disappear. Because Africans need to take responsibility for their future. The decision to develop the continent, to create jobs, to build an economy, to ensure that there is money in circulation is entirely an African decision. I am not saying that Western powers or colonial powers or slave masters did not negatively influence Africa's current state of affairs. What I'm saying is simple. We must take note of these difficulties in the past. It simply means we recognize the past, take lessons, shape strategies for the future, and implement them. Because if we continue blaming others, always looking for a boogeyman to hold responsible for Africa's problems, Africa will not develop. We will stay where we are. Though today's discussion begins with South Africa and the current anti-immigrant demonstrations, I want to examine the mindset that has shaped public conversations across Africa for decades. The mindset that searches for an oppressor to explain every failure. It is a mindset that assumes that Africans are never responsible for their own problems, and that historical injustices alone explain present-day underperformance. This raises an important question. And that question is about South Africa, but it expands. Is South Africa's story really unique? Or is it simply revealing something much larger about Africa? Let us think about that for a second. It goes beyond South Africa and it examines the culture of blame across Africa, why South Africa reflects a broader continental mindset, the need to move from victimhood to responsibility in Africa, the difficult questions Africans must ask themselves, the lessons the continent should draw from South Africa, and how Africa can begin building its next chapter. The latest wave of anti-immigrant demonstrations in South Africa has once again forced difficult questions on Africa. The immediate explanations we hear and read are very familiar. Unemployment, crime, pressure on public services. These concerns cannot simply be dismissed. They are legit. South Africa continues to experience one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. While economic growth has remained stagnant for years, any serious conversation must begin by acknowledging these realities. The reality is that the more the people in a system where the government takes care of welfare and social amenities, there is competition for those resources. And once there is competition, those who feel entitled or those who are entitled start identifying those who are not entitled, those who don't have a right to them, or those who are causing unhealthy competition for those limited resources. Once this happens, you start blaming one another, you start finding the source. But of course, beneath these immediate causes in South Africa lies a deeper philosophical problem, one that extends far beyond South Africa itself. As I said, this reflection doesn't focus only on South Africa, it looks at the bigger picture. Before I continue, thank you so much for joining the Beyond Africa podcast today. I am your host as usual, Brandon Ngalim. And as always, my goal is to present a thoughtful commentary that encourages discussion rather than simply repeating popular narratives. So let's be clear about something. South Africa remains one of Africa's greatest success stories. Having completed my doctoral studies there, I have enormous respect for the country and sincerely hope it continues to prosper. Before we continue this conversation, I want to mention something. Many of the ideas we're discussing today, that is the mindset, the adaptation skills, how to understand the systems, and the hidden rules of life abroad, are explored and written in more detail in my new book. If you have ever felt that living abroad is more complicated than simply getting a visa or finding a job, this book is for you. Or if you're still in Africa and planning to travel abroad, irrespective of the country, this book is for you. If you newly arrived in a new country, this book is for you. If you're a parent thinking of sending your child abroad, this book is for you. Even if you have lived abroad for some time and you think you want to understand what life should be or what life is, this book is for you. It is very brief and written to serve you. You can download a free copy of the book at beyondafricapodcast.com. That is Beyond Africa Podcast, all in one word.com. The link is also in the description below. Thank you so much. Now let's get back into the conversation. The liberation mindset that helped African countries win political independence did not fully evolve into a mindset focused on building and governing. We continued fighting long after independence had already been achieved. As a result, we remain psychologically conditioned to search for an enemy somewhere outside ourselves. The immigrant has become the new scapegoat. In South Africa today, the external target has increasingly become migrants. Talk of Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, Malawians, Nigerians, Somalis, Cameroonians, Ghanaians, name them, all from Africa. Some South Africans have complained that you blame Africans, but for the others who are in South Africa, you do not say a word. Why? Food for thought. When jobs become scarce and public services deteriorate, when jobs become scarce and public services deteriorate, it becomes politically and emotionally convenient to conclude that someone else is responsible. Immigrants are accused of taking jobs, increasing crime, overwhelming hospitals and schools, or displacing local businesses. Yet, even if every foreign national left South Africa tomorrow, the country's structural economic problems would remain. The central problem is not that migrants occupy too many jobs. The problem is that the economy produces too few jobs. That frustration is real. The diagnosis, however, is often misplaced. The absence of jobs is not primarily an immigrant problem. It is an economic problem. It is a policy problem. What are the policy solutions to encourage job creation, to encourage the viability of the economy? These are questions that could be covered in another point of reflection. Next, South Africa is only a mirror of Africa. This pattern is not unique to South Africa. Across Africa, we frequently explain our development challenges through the language of victimhood. We speak about colonialism, slavery, apartheid, neocolonialism, multinational exploitation, unfair global trade. These are real historical happenings. Colonialism inflicted enormous political, economic, and institutional damage to Africa, no doubt. Apartheid devastated generations of South Africans. Many international systems continue to disadvantage developing countries. History matters. It deserves to be remembered. It must be taught. But history cannot become our permanent operating system. There is an important difference between recognizing historical injustice and organizing an entire national and continental mindset around it. If someone blames others for every setback, they stop examining their own decisions and decision-making processes. They stop improving. The same danger exists for nations and continents. Instead of asking who is responsible for our failures, we should ask, what institutions have we built or failed to build? Why are we Africans not globally competitive? Why are our educational systems failing to produce practical skills? Why do our regulatory systems across Africa discourage investment? Why do graduates from African universities leave university without solving real-world problems? Why do African governments continue borrowing while infrastructure remains weak? These questions are uncomfortable, but they require responsibility rather than outrage. Outrage and anger are easy. Everyone can get them. But responsibility, self-reflection, and the courage to say you are wrong and you need a new path doesn't come easy. But we need to force that onto ourselves across Africa. That is why we're talking next about why historical memory must be accompanied by current responsibility. Yesterday, many South Africans understandably blamed apartheid for economic exclusion. Today, some direct that same frustration toward African immigrants. Across Africa, others continue directing every frustration toward colonialism or neocolonialism. Again, these are historical truths, no doubt, no dispute, no argument. But they cannot explain every failed policy 50, 60, or 70 years after independence. Nor should they excuse weak institutions, failed educational systems, poor governance, or economies that have failed to diversify. At some point, responsibility must accompany memory. We cannot use history to avoid accountability. We cannot use historical happenings to avoid taking responsibility for our failures. We cannot use historical happenings to refuse to look into the mirror. Let's look into the mirror and see what is wrong with us, our policies, and our approach towards Africa. This takes us to the next point, which is questions for African leaders. I might have sounded like I'm talking to the common you and me on the street, but African leaders bear responsibility because sometimes these are the people who sponsor all the media, academic, or all the information we have out there about Africa's failures. So, these questions are not only for ordinary citizens, they are equally for leaders. When Nelson Mandela fought for South Africa's freedom, did he imagine that the future generations would blame fellow Africans for South Africa's frustrations? Perhaps yes, perhaps not, but I doubt, because the rest of Africa gave South Africans enormous support during the fight against apartheid. But it is a question worth asking. If Africa is to develop, we must change the questions we ask. Instead of asking, who is taking our jobs, we should ask, why are we Africans creating so few jobs? Instead of asking, who is using our public services across Africa, we should ask, why are our public institutions so weak across Africa? Instead of asking who exploited Africa, we should ask, what companies, technologies, universities, and institutions are we building today across Africa? Development is ultimately built around production, not grievance, not outrage, not complaints, not fights, not scapegoating. This takes us to our next point, which is building Africa rather than remembering what happened to Africa. Victimhood discourages production. Victims blame. Builders create. 70 years after independence, should Africa still define itself primarily by colonialism or slavery or apartheid? History deserves remembrance, but responsibility belongs to the present. The responsibility now is ours. You, me, Africa. That is our responsibility. This takes me to the next topic, which is education must produce builders. One place we can start transforming Africa is education. I recently watched a video of Elon Musk where he argued that the United States sends too many talented people into finance and law instead of engineering and science. Whether one agrees with him or not, the broader point deserves attention. Societies advance by building. Across much of Africa, education devotes enormous attention to political history and historical injustice. But history alone does not build economies. Across Africa, we should devote more energy to engineering, manufacturing, entrepreneurship, software development, logistics, agriculture, scientific research, industrial problem solving. China did not become globally competitive because it spent every public discussion debating historical grievances. It invested heavily in engineering, manufacturing, sciences, and production, and even sent some of their best students to go study this in different countries, in the United States and across Europe. And these students always return to work for the country. Africa can do the same. That takes me to the next line, which is Africa must advance African interests. Too often, we debate which global power we should support. I follow these conversations online every day, and I wonder, what is our interest in arguing? Should we align with China, America, India, Iran, Israel? I find these conversations irrelevant. What I think we should do at any point is, why do we think these countries compete? How did these countries reach at a level of competing with one another? What can we copy from these countries so we can shape African countries to also reach that level of competition? No, the conversation is always this one good, this one bad, this one neo-colonial, this one not. Meanwhile, if any of these countries get the opportunities to do what the other countries are doing across Africa, they will not hesitate. So, while these countries continue advancing their own national interest, Africa must learn to advance its own. Some have argued that external powers prevent African development. Sometimes it is true, largely. Sometimes it is not. But why is it true? Can they do that without us? All these are done with our consent, with our participation, and with us doing the dirty job. No foreign country prevented African governments from building expensive football stadiums. When you even think further, some have argued that foreign governments stop African governments from doing investments or from building their local capacities. But come to think of it, did any foreign government prevent an African government from taking loans from China, Turkey, and other countries to construct expensive football stadiums to host the African Nations Cup? If we can build stadiums, we can build roads, we can build manufacturing companies, we can even build refineries. Dangote has done it in Nigeria. That shows we can do it. And if we can do all these, we can also reform our education. We can modernize our infrastructure by ourselves. We can strengthen institutions, and ultimately, that responsibility rests with us. How many African countries have thought about taking advantage of their diaspora? These are the resources we need to build. And that takes me to the next point, which is we need more builders, not talkers. Africa simply needs more construction, more engineers, more manufacturers, more entrepreneurs, more scientists, researchers, innovators, and more builders. Countries are built when these people come together because they make things. If you make something, you can sell it. If you talk, you cannot sell it for much value. Yes, some people buy, but talking ends up in slogans, and slogans don't build countries. Online, most Africans criticize South Africa, and to the extent that some Africans have refused to support South Africa as they play the World Cup. I think that is wrong. I do support South Africa. All African teams, I support them. But South Africa's current crisis is much bigger than immigration. It is a warning about what happens when economic frustration collides with a culture of blame. When every national disappointment requires an external enemy, the enemy simply changes over time, but the problems remain, and the cycle never solves the underlying problem. This takes me to a point we must never neglect: the need for critical thinking. Once a popular explanation dominates public discourse, politics, education, entertainment, and commentary often reinforce it. Few people stop to ask the difficult questions. How? Why? What is the evidence? How did the evidence come about? But critical thinking becomes increasingly challenging and difficult to find. Questioning dominant narratives is often treated as disloyalty rather than intellectual responsibility. Yet, if Africa should develop, we require exactly this kind of questioning. So, what next for Africa? Africa's future will not be determined by how accurately we recount historical grievances or by how accurately we decide which superpower or which strong power to support. However, Africa's future will ultimately be determined by what Africans can build: productive economies, competitive businesses, resilient institutions, modern infrastructure, skilled workers, societies capable of solving their own problems. Close your eyes for a moment and think. All the conversations you've heard about, should we choose America, Europe, China, Iran, Israel, all these focus around one thing. They are superior powers. And these superior powers came from the economies. So our conversations should be, how did they get these? What did they do? What sacrifices did they make? And what lessons can we take from them? So the lesson from South Africa is therefore not simply about immigration. While history deserves remembrance, responsibility demands action. Africa's development needs action. Africa's next chapter will belong not to those who complain most effectively, but to those who build most successfully. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this discussion valuable, please like, subscribe, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Let me leave you with this one question. Do you believe Africa should continue organizing its public conversation around identifying those responsible for Africa's problems? Or should we begin organizing our thinking around the solutions we must build? I look forward to reading your perspective. Thank you.